We are going to have our first keynote up here in just a moment with a good friend of mine, Shaun Connell. I call him Professor Shaun because over the last year, I've been working really hard to understand energy. Those of you that understand Bitcoin mining understand the important relationship between Bitcoin mining and energy. And as someone who's an advocate for this technology, I wanted to make sure that as I went out there and I talked to lawmakers and I talked to regulators, policymakers, staffers, and the general public, that we were representing Bitcoin mining as a technology in an appropriate fashion. So it took a lot of work on my part and on several members of our team to better understand how energy works. It's very complex, extremely complex, in fact. And it's different everywhere you go. You know, as an organization, we go from state to state talking to lawmakers and folks in the policy world and the energy world about Bitcoin mining. And everywhere we go, the energy systems are different and highly complex. And then, so in order to have those conversations, in order to have them go the right direction, we have to have a good foundation in the principles of energy. And so as I was going through this journey of trying to learn about Bitcoin mining and energy, I spoke quite a bit with Shaun Connell. He's over there at Lancium, and he would go through these various presentations with me, one-on-one Zoom calls, and he would share with me how power markets work, how demand response work, how ancillary services work. And it was a critical component in my education and understanding how the flow of energy works and how exactly does demand response and other ancillary services that Bitcoin miners are participating in, how does that actually have a positive impact on the grid? You know, I get questions all the time. They're like, well, why are these Bitcoin miners getting paid to shut down, wind down? And he was able to answer those questions very succinctly. Now, I'm not going to turn around and sort of regurgitate every little bit of my education from Shaun. You'll get in a moment, you'll be able to hear directly from the man himself. But certainly, if you get the chance, come on down, sit down up front. I know it gets a little busy back there, so if you're planning on listening into Shaun, which you should, good to see you. He's a very important person in this space when it comes to understanding this technology, understanding Bitcoin mining, and the opportunities that it has for us as a country and for us as individuals and us as a country that's trying to make sure that we foster innovation, we foster the growth of this technology. So in just a moment, I'm going to have Shaun, you ready? I'm going to have Shaun come up here for our first keynote on the mining panel. And please, if you're in the back and you're planning on listening in, come on up front. There's plenty of seats up front here now. And thank you very much. Oh, and we're going to have Shaun here. Shaun Connell. Great to see you, buddy.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining. So picture this. It's 2008. I'm on a trade floor here. I work for a power generation company. And we're really crammed in this small space because we're a trade floor this trade floor was only built 8 years prior. It's been growing and expanding. And the average age on the trade floor is like 30 years old because this is a really new industry to actually optimize generation assets. So I'm here in this picture. I'm super excited because for the last 2 years, gas prices have gone from $5 up to $13. And we're super excited because we have a lot of power generation that's not hedged, right? Just sounds kind of familiar for the space that we're in for Bitcoin. We're just saying like, we're heroes, right? Like we chose to not hedge this. And we're excited now because we're high-fiving because the price of actually producing power from these coal assets was $40. And with gas at 13, we're getting paid $150, right? So we're just killing it. And so we're looking at this and we're saying, man, like with everything that's going on, kind of like China and the adoption of these fossil fuels, it's like the prices are going to 20. So we're like, let's not hedge anymore. Turns out that was the peak. 2 months later, the price of gas is down to $4, right? And we're just sitting there, it's like, man, what were we thinking, right? What should we have done different, right? And again, these are kind of like some similar lessons. So the company I was working for had 15 gigawatts of power generation that we're hedging. And we had some scars, right, from this experience where we could have hedged at these high prices, but we survived. However, not everybody survived, right? And some of these names that you'll see familiar, some of these have gone away permanently, like the Enron, where some of these other companies have emerged from bankruptcies, but essentially the scars were fatal to these companies, and they didn't survive through this type of environment, to this high volatility in these competitive markets. So there's a great parallel of kind of what happened in power generation with what's actually happening in Bitcoin mining. So my name is Shaun Connell. I'm the EVP at Lancium. I'm from Alberta, Canada, which is often referred to as the Texas of Canada. We're rich in energy and entrepreneurial spirit. For the first 20 years of my career, I worked for a power generation company. It was when there was no such thing as trade floors, so it was a brand new space. So I helped build and lead that trade floor. In 2019, I did a deep dive on Bitcoin mining, and I had this deja vu moment, right? Because everything that was happening in the Bitcoin mining space had already happened in power generation 15 years ago. And you can see these kind of Bitcoin miners trying to figure out, saying like, how do I get to kind of sustainable earnings versus this big kind of chop and volatility? In that time, in the early years of my trading with this power generation company, were the most exciting for me, and I wanted to repeat that. And so I decided to leave the power generation space in 2020. I now work for a company called Lancium. I'm the EVP of Power. What I've been doing is doing what I did for a power generation company, which is building out a power desk and helping with other Bitcoin miners that are our customers on how to be more profitable through the power service that we offer and some of the technologies that we use to kind of help them be more efficient in their operations. So to help kind of draw the comparison to kind of where we are in Bitcoin mining markets, here's a little bit of a small kind of history on kind of the power space. Is that from 1910 to about 1990, all power markets were regulated, which meant that it was a really cushy gig if you were the chosen power generator, because there's no market participants that come in your space, there's no competition, you were guaranteed a rate of return, and so it's very, very low risk. In the late 90s, they changed this and they said, we're gonna move these to being more competitive markets. And that shift said, no longer are you protected in your space about having to kind of have no competition, but anybody can come in your space. You're not gonna get a guaranteed rate of return, and it's gonna be kind of based on the actual market-based price signals. So you can imagine the company I worked for is a 100-year-old power company. At this time was 90 years into it. So all the things that they had done and how they built the company around this regulated framework wouldn't work in this new competitive market, right? So they had to change and to learn how do you become competitive in this market, which is kind of what it's happening now in the Bitcoin space, because it is a competitive market. You compete against everybody. As mentioned, some of them didn't survive, right? And I share this slide here to kind of draw the parallels to some kind of recent bankruptcies that happened in the mining space. And so for the companies that failed, there were some that were from high debt levels, right? So their debt levels are so high, and from the environment that they hadn't done any type of hedging, that their cash flows actually couldn't allow them to service their debt. So the company went under. Inadequate risk hedging, which is, I'm a power generator, I'm gonna forward sell my power, but I'm not gonna hedge my fuel cost, right? And then the fuel cost goes through here, and then you're stuck and you're like, shit, wish I would have hedged that, right? Which is the same thing kind of what's happening in the mining space about how these energy costs went from down here and then shot up. You're like, it's like, shit, should hedge that. But furthermore, it's just not that easy to hedge that, right? Because of the credit issues as well. So very similar comparisons about some of the challenges that these companies had, and not everyone was able to transition to the competitive markets. So what emerged out of this was that these power generation companies had to come up with what I'm calling here a profitability playbook. The company I worked for, as mentioned, had 15 gigawatts of generation, so we built all these in-house, right? So we came in with all these kind of capabilities, and we were able to actually use them for ourselves, and we were able to provide these for other companies that would have had less of a portfolio generation, that we could provide those services. So example of the company I worked at is we developed market intelligence about understanding the actual market. Where should we be kind of understanding the power grid? Where should we site new generation? Can we make some acquisitions? So really understanding the fundamentals of kind of what would be a good location for these assets. Risk management, hedging these, about hedging the fuel costs on the inputs, hedging on the outputs, so that way you're stabilizing your cash flows. Asset optimization, we had a full trade floor that would have the hedging for these positions there, making sure that you have no big exposures. And then when you're taking these assets into delivery, is you're making these decisions on a day ahead about what do I do for ancillary services? How do I operate this plant most efficiently? Again, very similar to what's happening now in the mining space. On the regular side, you want to stay compliant. And also you want to kind of avoid some compliance fines, which could be really a kill shot, but there's really great opportunities as well in understanding the regulatory frameworks and markets. And lastly is, technology is that you want to have, the best in class technology for producing the lowest cost megawatts with the best technology for delivering to the grid. So these companies had to adopt this type of playbook to be the producer of the low cost megawatt. Enter Bitcoin mining, right? Bitcoin mining is the new competitive commodity market. And I would argue that it is going to be much harder than the power generation market. The reason is that power generation, so the company that I worked for had a lot of generation in Alberta. Our competition was all the generation that's connected to the wires in Alberta, right? So to compete, you had to be in that region to go against us to produce that low cost megawatt. Whereas Bitcoin mining is a global competition, right? Anybody in the world can participate in Bitcoin mining. And so you're not constrained by just the wires in the grid. It's anybody that can plug in this miner with an Ethernet cable is now competing. So I'd argue that this is going to be even more fierce of a competition than it is in power generation. So quick background on kind of the evolution of mining, and I'm kind of emphasis on the increase in power generation. 2009, everybody's kind of mining on laptops. They mentioned it's kind of like a hobbyist. Put this as 0.0002 megawatts for this laptop. Start to transition, start to put these kind of miners into containers. You've got like 2 megawatts. And now we're getting these very large data centers that are 500 megawatts plus. And you can see that the pace of growth and the scale of megawatts, and the real takeaway on this is more megawatts means more competition, right? More fierce on kind of who is going to be the lowest cost provider of hash rate. There's a lot on this chart, so I'm going to explain it, kind of what to look at. This is the past 10 years of Bitcoin mining for power usage and margins. The blue bars represent power usage over the 10-year period. And then mining margins are represented by the green line is the average revenue per megawatt hour received for mining across the entire network, the average. And then the red is the average power cost for miners over that same time period. And so what you can see from this, and the margins would be the green line subtract the red line. So you can see from here is that power usage has gone exponential. From 2018 to present, power usage is growing at 25% per year. Right back in 2017, when I was introduced to Bitcoin mining, 1.5 gigawatts was the total network-ish. We're now at 15 gigawatts, a 10x. That's massive. You'll see that the green line has the volatility of the halving cycles. So a lot of volatility to the cycle. And for the first time 2 years ago, we saw this uptick in power costs, right? So the punchline is that, margins are getting tighter and there's more amount of competition that's becoming the grid. So what could the next 10 years look like, or the next few halving cycles? This chart here now to the left, where it says past cycles, I've summarized each of those 4-year cycles. And I have a future cycle to the right for the next 4 cycles. And in my future scenario, I've used an average growth rate of 10% per year for Bitcoin mining for the power usage to increase per year. And I've averaged that for the next halving cycle, that the average price of Bitcoin is 100K. Following that, it's going to double to 200K, then 400 and 800. Folks here that think that's conservative, anybody outside this room will think that's crazy, and you guys will think it's conservative. But using this logic and the math around kind of the issuance of Bitcoin, you'll start to see that the revenue is trending down into the right, which is meaning that less average revenue, so the more competition. We're on the last panel, all about efficiencies, new market participants entering the space. And the red line is the average price of power. I'm holding it constant. And the punchline is that in commodity markets is that, these the revenues and the costs are going to converge, right? And they're going to come to these kind of razor thin margins. And so it's going to be who's going to be the lowest cost provider for that hash rate. So mining is brutally competitive. I mentioned the last panel, I had to look at my phone, is that there is a new miner of Tether, right? So I don't have that market participant on here. I've got, some of our, public companies. I've got Riot and Marathon on here. Some nation states that have kind of publicly announced that they're doing mining, new ones that could come into the space. I put on Exxon up there just to represent kind of global oil and gas companies. But essentially that they're going to realize is that this is a way to monetize energy. And so anybody's going to plug in, right? So a new participant that's not on here is Tether, and the punchline is there's more competition. So miners, right, this is again back to the deja vu moment, is miners are now adopting these playbooks that were done before in power markets, and it's mirroring what happened in the past, right? And so for Lancium, this is what we do for our services, and it's market intelligence, which is understanding the grid on kind of where do you site these facilities. Like 5-6 years ago, somebody started a company, they're just gonna plug it in by close to where they live. Right now, it's like, where is a good location that's gonna be low cost energy for a long period of time? Risk management, how do I stabilize my revenue streams based on my business model, right? Like if I'm doing hosting, right, hedging this cash flow to match my hosting agreement, potentially doing hash rate contracts with that. On the asset optimization, very similar type of activity. Power generators, every day that they're kind of making decisions on saying, what is the best way to run my asset the next day? Should I be doing ancillary? Should I be doing energy? Coming into real time, should I be changing that up? Right? So it's really about driving the most amount of value through how you interface with the market. And so miners are starting to do this as well now. Regulatory compliance, lots of rule changes happening at ERCOT, and it's being doing advocacy about kind of influencing the market design. So having regulatory capabilities in-house to kind of help guide what's good for your business. And then for technologies, I use on here kind of having new firmwares and load control. Lansing, we have something called Smart Response that helps with the load control, but having the best technologies available to help you be super dynamic and participating in these markets. And similar to how power companies were on saying, like, based on the company where their expertise was, is like, do I build this or buy this, right? And the tombstones I represented earlier were the ones that chose to do neither or just had the bad playbooks, and they die. I got 3 kind of examples of playbooks here. And this one I'm calling like the dead playbook, which is essentially just having a miner and plugging it in. These next 3 slides are using an example of 1 megawatt of S19 miners in West Texas from October 22 to November 2023. And under the scenario of having kind of just the playbook of saying, I'm just gonna plug in my miner and just kind of see what happens. This miner here would have been connected at distribution voltage, so they weren't taking advantage of having less TDSP charges, and they're doing no optimization. So this miner is getting $100,000 of margin that now needs to be put towards debt service, other operational costs, right? But this is kind of how it started. And as more competition happens, what's likely going to go away first. A better playbook, this example of the miner that is going to be connecting at transmission voltage to avoid distribution costs. They're going to participate in avoiding transmission costs. In ERCOT, it's called a 4CP. So how do I minimize these costs? And then they're going to do ancillary services around the clock every day, except for those kind of TDSP hours where they're going to try and avoid. You see that this is pretty good, right? On the last one, we're 120K. We've now done like a 3.5x on changing the behaviors and how you're participating in the market, which is very good for grid operators, right? Because now they're getting a more flexible resource that's interfacing with their grid versus just a load that's just pulling and causing additional strain when energy can be scarce. Last one, this is what Lansing does. I'm calling this the full playbook, citing a transmission voltage, using best-in-class technology. We use our Smart Response. We do this on our facilities, and we do this for other customers. Having an optimization that you're doing prior to day ahead, essentially having different hedges that, these miners are essentially like real options, your long volatility. And so you can actually trade the same way power generators do and monetizing that volatility before delivery. So taking part in those activities to kind of drive down your costs. Day ahead, we've got a team in Houston that makes decisions every day to kind of like, how are we going to be making the offering into ancillaries for next day versus energy? What do we do with our length of energy hedge? Do we sell it versus run? How are we going to take that into real time? What is the best way to run that facility? But constantly making decisions all the way in the day ahead, all the way into real time. So pulling that all together, right? We saw that picture of the global competition and all these additional competitors in the space. And so as the next, as the halving's coming close and, hash rate's coming offline, right? So which ones are going to fail first? Is the first one's going to be the one that's going to fail first, right? And then it starts to kind of work its way up. But you see lots of different miners being very aggressive in how they're actually handling this. And we hear a lot on these panels about different efficiencies. For Lansing, what we're doing, this is approximately almost like a 5x better than just hashing around the clock. And again, that's making constant decisions, having a team that's making these about how do you optimize these sites. Similar to kind of power as the lowest cost megawatt wins, as this is the lowest cost provider of hash rate. And how do you do that? And again, it's, do I build or buy? And if you don't, it's die, right? And so time is of the essence and having to figure that out. And miners are actively doing that. So key messages, both power and mining are very competitive markets. I'd argue mining is more competitive. Having a deja vu moment of what happened in the power space is exactly relevant to what's happening in mining right now. And following kind of what happened in Power Through is kind of foreshadowing what's happening in mining in the future. The power companies that failed to evolve ended up dying. Companies had the choice of building, and they built themselves, or they actually outsourced through other companies to take that on for them. In the mining space, brutally competitive. As we go into this next halving and we go from, say, 15 gigawatts today to 30 gigawatts in a couple of years to 60 to 100, right, is that it's going to be just table stakes to know that you have to be super dynamic and how you're operating your facility to be that lowest cost provider. Miners must decide to build or die, and I'll just comment that, you know, it really is a win when miners are being super dynamic, because if you think about having 100 gigawatts of Bitcoin miners on the grid, you've got a happy miner that's actually doing low cost mining for how they're participating. You got a very happy grid operator because they have all these new flexible resources that they can use for actually kind of dispatching up and down to manage intermittency. And you get happy kind of customers of the power grids because they get reliable power, and a lot of these demand response products are actually driving down those prices, so you get happy customers as well. Last point out here is that miners at various stages of implementation, right? Some are further along, some are less, but all of them are recognizing the importance of doing so. I'd say that those who fail to evolve, got the tombstone here for the next cycle, right? Don't be that company, right? There will be some, but you know, the time is now to kind of make those changes. With that, I'd like to thank you for the time, and if you want to learn more about what Lansing's doing, we have a booth at the back there. You can drop by and see us.
Hey guys, thanks for coming out to the 2023 North American Blockchain Summit. It was the best summit yet. We look forward to hosting you again next year. If you enjoyed the summit or like what you saw in this video, be sure to subscribe. If you're interested in learning more about membership in the TBC, go to texasblockchaincouncil.org to learn more.